Shefveland here. She is an associate professor of history at the University of Southern Indiana, a scholar of the Indigenous Eastern Woodlands of North America. Her research and publications focus on the intersections of settlers and Indigenous peoples in the American Southeast. She is currently working on a book on historical memory of Florida and collecting oral histories from the Evansville region for the River Cities Oral History Project, a collaborative public and digital history effort between community members and USI students. Please help me welcome Ms. Shefveland.
Thank you very much for having me this evening to have a conversation and to talk about settler and Indigenous history and memory of the Wabash and Ohio River Valley. It's an area that I love to research and to talk about because I believe that having an understanding of the ways in which we write history as well as the archive itself is an incredibly important discussion to have. So to begin with a quote, "This history is a recital of prominent local events of our people from the earliest days to the present. Their habits and customs and growth will be told in the simple, plain manner of those pioneers. I had almost said, in the open, frank style of that heroic age, when bravery was exercised and deeds of valor performed, when the protection of life and the guarding of property were the incentives to action, when the home and the family were jealously watched against the wiles of the skulking Indians, when the vain ambitions of conventional society of this swift day were entirely wanting." So begins Joseph Peter Elliott's History of Evansville and Vanderburgh County, a sweeping narrative published in 1897 during the Gilded Age, when many paraprofessional historians sought to capture the settlement period and crafted a nationalist tone that championed white settlement. Beginning in the booster literature of the 19th century and continuing through pioneer and frontier settlement memory projects, one can start to see the casting and reframing of Indigenous peoples in stories to fit into and justify American settler ambitions. As one scholar of the West in memory, David Roble, has described it, we must consider the construction of history, the construction of memory, and how memories are not merely reflected or reproduced, but at times even invented. Settlers of the entire United States have both selectively created memories in history that highlight the stories and events they want to remember. Pioneer reminiscence, like promotional literature, are used as a mirror to reflect the outlooking of those doing the reminiscing, rather than as a clear window on the actual events that are described between the covers of their accounts. And indeed, some of the publishing houses at this time almost sent out like a Mad Libs version of settler history. They would send them out to individual counties so that you would find that if you looked at a settler history of Florida, you would find it very similar to the settler history of Indiana. Just one example, I'm not saying from personal experience. Settler history, though, of the Miamis, Wyandottes, Delawares, Potawatomis, Kickapoos, Shawnees, Wayas, Cherokees, and Pinkashas of the region have been deliberate acts of dispossession by words and memory that preserve an often inaccurate portrayal of what actually occurred. It's not just settler violence, it's not just Indigenous violence. Often what's forgotten are the coalescing communities that live side by side with one another and continue to live side by side to this day. But with these stories, we see settler movement into the Ohio and Wabash River valleys dispossessing physical land and dispossessing through history itself. So just a few stories that I'd like to share with you today, and I will be quoting directly from a number of primary sources of the region. The areas of focus for my talk are on Evansville founder, Major Hugh McGary, the Captivity Narrative of Isaac Knight, and finally on the Indiana Centennial and how settlers of the Ohio and Wabash Valley, the Pocket, celebrated that event and crafted stories of the Indigenous past. So, first up, almost forgot, I had pictures. So here is Joseph P. Elliott in the history of Evansville and Vanderburgh County. So these progressive stories, these large, sweeping narratives. This is when historians are just starting to hone their craft and becoming professional historians. Early histories throughout the early 19th century, local histories, were often genealogical in focus. So these are the lawyers of the day who are talking about heroic endeavors of their ancestors. But people like Eliot are trying to write larger histories for the purpose of teaching Indiana history in the schools. So, throughout American history and popular culture, the key ideologies describing Indian people, as illustrated in Phil Deloria's landmark Indians in Unexpected Places, are inevitable disappearance, primitive purity, and savage violence, which are a function of the body of accepted knowledge about Indian people and the colonial and, quote, imperial relations of power and domination existing between Indian people and the United States. These include common stereotypes of lazy nomadic hunters, frequent use of the words like skulking, outbreak, rebellion, uprising, that reveal fears of violent resistance to settler domination. Heading west, whether it be the steady stream of settlers driving across the plains in their Conestoga wagons, or the inexorable march of the technologies such as the telegraph and the railroad, these all seem to be part of a noble part of the myths of this nation. And for much of the history of this nation, it's been embodied by Daniel Boone. Daniel Boone headed west through the Cumberland Gap with settlers. Thinking of the story of Daniel Boone, at least his version that is presented and well accepted by popular histories, some of the themes that feed into the mythology of the American West are frontier violence, Indians versus white settlers, scalping. Who was doing this? Americans, Indians? White-on-white violence was also quite common. Rugged individualism is a major theme. A brave, hardy man protecting his family, living off the lands, applying your own skills in order to survive. Captivity, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. But the constant refrain is how brave white settlers overcame Indian savages, and a transition from a howling wilderness to sylvan lands. That is the core story that is often told about Boone, presented as an important figure in the birth of our nation, a drama that happens out west. Of course, the west is here, the frontier is here, and the line between civilization and savagery. Eliot frames Hugh McGary in much the same way as more national stories of Boone do, as the hero of the campaign to tame the wilderness. Opening, he says, the hut of Colonel Hugh McGary during the fur season, which is during the months of the year that contain the letter R, was adorned with, on the outer walls with coon skins, bear and wolf skins, and occasion a buckskin. But old Colonel was not only a brave Indian fighter, but a hunter and trapper of note in his day. Colonel McGary had a reputation as an Indian fighter that was equal to that of Colonel Daniel Boone of Kentucky, of whom he was once a neighbor and a close companion. Colonel McGary's record as an Indian fighter began in Kentucky as a bushwhacker after the Redskins. And like Kit Carson, or Buffalo Bill, he prided himself in running them out of the country and in swooping down on them and breaking up their little rendezvous whenever he thought they were getting too bold. McGary was indeed involved in a number of skirmishes in Kentucky against the Wyandots, Miamis, Potawatomis, Shawnees, and Cherokee. While Eliot frames McGary as a hero and a frontier bushwhacker, the reality is a little bit more grim. He was a famous hunter and an Indian fighter. He had come to Kentucky with his family in 1775. By January 1781, was appointed one of the first justices for Kentucky. July 1781, commissioned major of the Lincoln County Militia. But by 1782, armed by the British, the Shawnees, the Mingos, the Delawares, and Wyandots had resolved to drive white settlers out of the Great Meadow in Kentucky with assistance from their British allies. Now, Major Hugh McGary was considered by his contemporaries as rash and insubordinate in the American Revolution, contributing largely to the devastating defeat of American forces at Blue Licks, allegedly ignoring Daniel Boone's warning that Indians in their line of sight across the river were just decoys. McGary is said to have shouted, "Them that ain't cowards follow me and I'll show you where the yellow dogs are." The battle was a horrifying defeat for the Americans, including Daniel Boone, whose son Israel died from a shot to the heart trying to help his father retreat in the chaotic aftermath of the ambush. In 1785, McGary murdered an Indian chief who was a prisoner to troops commanded by Colonel Benjamin Logan. His name was Malantha. Malantha had become the Grand Sachem of the Shawnee after Chief Cornstalk had been assassinated at Fort Randolph in 1777. Though his fatal misconduct at Blue Licks appeared to have brought him no punishment, he was court-martialed on March 21st, 1787 at Bardstown, Kentucky, found guilty of murder and killing Malantha and of insubordination for the insult and abuse of Lieutenant Colonel Trotter of Fayette County, who had tried to save the prisoner's life. The sentence was suspended for 1 year, and it appears that McGary was allowed to resign. He eventually moved west and was responsible for the settlement at Lamasco, which became Evansville, with a Shawnee settlement still there along the Pigeon Creek. While white leaders set aside McGary's actions, Shawnee leader Tecumseh would later remember it in his 1810 speech about broken American promises, saying, "The same promises were given to the Shawnee one time. It was at Fort Finney, where some of my people were forced to make a treaty. Flags were given to my people, and they were told that they were now the children of the Americans. We were told, if any white people mean to harm you, hold up these flags, and you will then be safe from all danger. We did this in good faith, but what happened? Our beloved Chief Malantha stood with the American flag in front of him and that very peace treaty in his hand, but his head was chopped by an American officer, and that American officer was never punished." And I should note, in Eliot's version of Evansville and Vanderburgh history, he does not name Malantha. His name comes from Tecumseh's speech, but it is not mentioned in Eliot's narrative. He's just some Indian chief. Taking the ideas of settler memory in mind then, another reading from Joseph Eliot's history highlights the tropes of national mythology of settler innocence. The original families that groped their way through these western wilds, following Indian paths and deer trails, directed by the sun and the moon and the stars and the pocket compass, were the residents of Virginia, North Carolina, New York, and other colonial states who came west to better their condition by growing up with their country. They established the settlements of the towns. Before the settlement known as Lamasco or Evansville was thought of, Newburgh in Warwick County even became a more important landing place for steamboats, and in fact had a better landing than Evansville. And for many years, the principal tobacco, grain, and bacon markets of this section were at that port. When we take a look at these narratives, what we don't often include in this discussion are the promises that were made and why Indigenous peoples were attacking the settlers. That settlers were moving onto lands that had been promised to be protected repeatedly throughout the history of these treaties. These lands were intended to be protected. We also often forget, though, the promises that were made to settlers. So in this discussion, it's not about labeling guilt. It's about having a larger discussion about the promises that are made to different groups and taking a look at the narratives that we tell and the stories that we tell. So my second story is about Isaac Knight. First, talking a little bit about the genre of captivity narratives in general. One of the most popular types of reading throughout the 19th and early 20th century are captivity narratives, in fact, going all the way back to the colonial period. So these captivity narratives are the accounts written by men and women reporting on their experiences as abductees of Native Americans. From the 17th century to the end of the 19th century, such accounts accompanied the westward moving frontier, and their storylines are established in the first known captivity narrative by Mary Rowlandson in 1682, and it remains essentially the same. Conflict between the settlers and Indians, capture by the Indians, ordeal at the hands of the captors, and then a triumphant return to European American society. In general, male captives adjusted easier to their new lives with Native American people than did female captives, who, with very few exceptions, feared for their virtue, prayed for a return to civilization. Through the centuries in these captivity narratives, stock phrases are perpetuated. For example, bashing brains out, burning people at the stake, skulking, also shows up a lot, it's their favorite word. Their descriptions of elements of the captor's culture tend to be generic and confusing, but the message is pretty clear. Native American cultures are considered inferior to European American civilization, and Native Americans are perceived as emotionless, cruel, and traitorless. They're also often nameless. The captives' detailed descriptions of torture scenes and the suffering of women and children provided justification for armed conflict on the western frontier and the displacement of Native Americans, whose voices were very rarely heard in the captivity documents. Again, as I mentioned, often they're not even named. Isaac Knight related his story of captivity to Hiram Hunter, who published the narrative in 1839, stating in a note to the reader, the author has nothing to offer in apology except that it is at the request of many old acquaintances who have heard his tale of woe. Isaac relates his early years in Kentucky, along the Green River before his family sought to move to the Red Banks on the Ohio River, which becomes Henderson, in the hopes that this settlement would prove safer from Indian attack. However, they found that even greater difficulties were undergone by settlers than had been endured by them at Vienna on the Green River. Not only are Indian attacks a concern, but the inhumane conduct of such white men, Harkendale, Ayers, Ashley, Howard, Kane, and the Masons, who seem to, quote, delight in bloodshed and murder than in anything else. So these are the famed Ohio River cave-in-rock pirates. Also allegedly the first mass murderers in American history. One day, on the northern side of the Ohio River, now Union Township, basically USI, Isaac was taken captive by 6 Potawatomis and 2 Kickapoos. One other boy attempted to escape, Peter Sprinkle. He was about 17 years old. The captors shot him 3 times. Jacob Up was 7, finding escape impossible, he had to scream and cry, and they dispatched him quite quickly. With George Sprinkle and John Up in captivity, the Potawatomi and Kickapoo came upon Isaac and took him prisoner. Now, important thing to consider is why individuals are being taken captive. Yes, individuals are taken captive sometimes to ransom back, but they're often taken captive in order to take individuals in and adopt them. The Iroquois call this a mourning war, whereby they're going on these raids in order to take people in, bring their numbers back up, numbers that have been lost in war, numbers that have been lost to slaving, numbers that have been lost to disease. So while traveling northward, the party came upon 3 bears, which they killed and took with them to the Patoka River, where they cooked the bears and they rested. On the evening of the 3rd day, Isaac wrote that they produced the scalps of the 2 boys that the Potawatomi and Kickapoo had murdered. And after cutting the meat out of them, they carefully put it on sticks before the fire and cooked it. And then they shaped the remaining scalps of them. Now, this isn't violence just for violence sake. Taking trophies is an important part of Eastern Woodland practices during warfare. And utilizing violence as a lesson, this is not wanton violence. This is an act of ad interim. You behave, or this could very easily be you. Taking these acts and putting them into context. They danced and made their young prisoners, walked around with them, Isaac said. He would have them dance had they not been too exhausted. He said this was their regular employment every other night. Now, Isaac had been exposed to smallpox. In his discussion, he talked about how he had been vaccinated by smallpox. So just before the night of the 8th day of April, he had been exposed, and then he proceeds to get sick with smallpox. And he says in his narrative, he was still compelled to travel every day, even when scarcely he was able to hold up his head or help himself in the least. But his captors evidently took care of him. Clearly they're intending him for some sort of adoption. If he was too much of a burden for them, they would have easily killed him, set him off to the side. They actually kindled a fire for the night. They wrapped Isaac in 2 blankets. They placed him near the fire so he was able to spend the night. Now, he also writes then later, they continued to abuse him. They refused to offer him as much water as he desired. They kicked him. But it may have been another part of rituals of violence whereby abuse to adolescents is a way to toughen them up. To throw them into the water in the winter is a frequent occurrence. Benjamin Franklin actually wrote about this, and he's talking about Virginia. He said, Indigenous people have a tendency for their children to behave a lot better in July and August than they do in February when they're tossed in the water for misbehaving. And so it's a ritual of violence and abuse that in a lot of ways is meant to toughen people up. By the 15th day of his captivity, they entered the Illinois River and they came to a Kickapoo town where it was pretty clear from his narrative that he was slated for adoption. He talks about being terrified. He talks about he was sure that they were going to kill him. They're not going to carry you and take care of you and take you all the way to a Kickapoo town just to kill you. One evening, a company of 200 or 300 elderly Indians came marching in where the prisoners were kept. They brought 2 large kettles of hominy. They were beating their drums, rattling deer hooves, and making music of all sorts of different kinds. They marched several times around the hut and then with a great apparent solemnity placed the kettles on a handsome green. And when they were all seated around them, 2 men, waiting on the rest, divided the content of the kettles, put a small portion in every man's bowl, and they ladled it out for everyone in even parts. He then said that there was a long and lengthy ceremony, and on the 4th day, he was presented with moccasins by an elderly woman who gave him and some of the other prisoners something to eat. Soon after, she beckoned to Isaac that he was supposed to come with her, and this is an adoption ceremony. That the day's travels, when he went with her, started to make him feel ill again. His smallpox sores had started to bother him again, and so she wraps him up in a new blanket, and the woman seeks to make some preparations. She makes some salves for his smallpox sores. She cuts open some of the sores and rubs them to make them bleed, and then she causes him to go into the Illinois River to wash them out. And he says this is all done through kindness, although he felt it was pretty harsh treatment. She's trying to take care of him, but the smallpox, of course, spreads. Now he says their manner of treating the disease proved fatal in many instances. The severe sweat, jumping into the river, will, quote, terminate the existence of many. The woman who had taken him on, of course, dies. And that, he says, was a cause of much distressing in the mind. He had found her, quote, a true and tender friend, and one who was willing to do for him all that she could, but when he saw her taken from him, he found himself far from home, without a friend, among strangers, in the midst of foes, and surrounded with sickness, producing death in every direction. Now, many people die in this series of weeks that follow. He is placed, as he is the most healthy, in the care of many others in this situation. And he finds a woman who he is taking care of, becomes the victim of the disease, and she leaves behind a young child, 12 months old, which, it, quote, fell to Isaac's lot to nurse. Besides the attention he had to give to that infant, he wrote, it devolved on him to nurse the sick, to bury the dead, and frequently to do it all alone. Worn down with fatigue, he wrote, through this arduous labor, he devised the means to be relieved of the burden of the child. As he carried it on his back, wrapped up in a blanket in Indian style, he drew the blanket tighter and tighter around it, put an end to the baby's cries, quote, removed his own burdens. He murdered the child. After months, he will find himself in the area near Chicago. A year and a half later, he will be near a Lake Michigan trading area, and he will beg a lake barge operator, Captain Mills, for help. Mills will hide the boy on his boat and leave with him the following day, taking him in safety to Detroit. Eventually, he will end up at Fort Maumee. He will make his way back south to his family, who had long presumed him to be dead. He learned that his two other friends had escaped a year or so earlier. They were all reunited on the Kentucky side of the Ohio River. He would later move to the Vanderburgh County and establish a homestead in what would be called Knight Township. A painting depicting his capture is in the collection of the Evansville Museum of Arts, History and Science. And this oft-forgotten settler monument, commemorative marker, is near the site of his original grave, which is across from Barnes & Noble on Lincoln Avenue, just east of Green River Road. And I always like to point out this little part at the end, because I always ask my students, are you a school child of Vanderburgh County? Like, do you know anything about this? No idea what you're talking about. So I give extra credit a lot for students. I'm like, go find this. I don't tell them where it is. I'm like, just go somewhere on Green River. Third stories, Centennial Celebrations. And that was the one that's the story that was quite a surprise to me. It was not, I knew, of course, Hugh McGary, having experience as an Indian fighter, like, well, people are gonna die. I was totally expecting that. I was not expecting the Isaac Knight story to turn out the way that it did. But we move on into the Centennial Celebrations, and much of the way that we've created pageantry and Indiana history since. According to scholar James Joseph Buss, Jim, the state centennial celebrations of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois are the culmination of more than a century of pioneer veneration and a collective amnesia about the region's indigenous past, all of which informed self-proclaimed objective and scientific historical interpretations. For the hundreds of thousands of Americans who attended outdoor pageants and parades or purchased commemorative books printed to mark those occasions, these cultural artifacts projected a linear narrative that embodied the place story of a clear middle ground. No Indians left in Indiana, which we all know is certainly not the case. In Evansville, George McReynolds, a history teacher at Evansville High School, offered some advice to potential pageant masters in an article he wrote for the Indiana Magazine of History in 1915. He sets the stage for all of the centennial pageants that will follow. So he has some suggestions for its performance. McReynolds opined that a person who had never gone to school can appreciate this form of drama because it portrays only those things that can be easily understood and that have a permanent value. It is a better teacher than the textbook. To the pupils, an incentive to work. To the people in general, a kind of laboratory of history. These dramas should follow a familiar and appropriate narrative of Indiana history. The first episodes were Indigenous peoples selling or ceding the land. The second episodes would show pioneers or settlers entering the country, and the Indians never returned. Gone. A thing of the past, only in history, never a part of the story of Indiana again. In his suggested first episode, the focus was on the land sale in 1775 of 30,497,600 acres purchased from Pickashot Indians, stating the exact words of the deed may be quoted, showing how willing the Indians relinquished their right to this land for certain things such as blankets, ribbons, knives, kettles, gunpowder, lead, tobacco, salt, etc. The scene was then to be followed by the treaty between Governor William Henry Harrison and the Delaware on August 27, 1804, when they gave up lands south and including Evansville and most of southern Indiana. For the record, you want to Google things later, these land sales have been actually the center of several disputes throughout history, including the landmark Johnson and Graham's Lessee versus McIntosh, an 1823 United States Supreme Court decision authored by Chief Justice John Marshall, and the Miami have been in court as recently as 2001 about some of these land sales. So I'd like to talk just a little bit more today in the time that I've got left about the Posey, Warwick, and Vanderburgh pageants. McReynolds provided some examples of costumes, particularly for Indigenous peoples. He said the American Indian is easily portrayed with some green paint, turkey feathers, brown fleshings, painted canvas moccasins, and a bow and arrow. The costumes of friendly Indians should be made of leather or from leather-colored canton flannel in the matter of long trousers and shirts adorned with leather cut in strips and beadwork, feathers, lines of paint and fringe. Indian girls may wear short skirts and jackets similarly trimmed. Indians on the warpath must wear brown leggings, their loincloth, and the war bonnet. Now, war bonnets are, of course, Plains Indians, not Eastern Woodlands. The more and blue-yellow paint on their faces, the better it is, McReynolds wrote. Do not dispatch Indians to fight with blankets on their shoulders. I'm sure it was more of a technical thing. They'll lose the blanket, someone will trip over it. The pioneer frontiersman must have his coonskin cap, fringed buckskin coat, and long Kentucky hunting rifle. So just a little bit about the different pageants. The Vanderburgh County pageant was the first of the pageants out of the 3 counties I'd like to talk about on May 10th and 11th in connection with the State Grand Army of the Republic encampment. So it must have been an extremely exciting time in Evansville and Boise Field. The pageant was written by one Miss Albion Bellows Bacon, the Progressive Era activist, and directed by Carl Dreich. According to Mrs. Bacon, there were more volunteers than there were parts, with nearly 4,000 people participating in the performance. As with Posey, the pageant will be a 2-evening presentation. It opens with mound builders, dim lights suggesting the mystery that hangs over the early history of the country. Brighter light will follow the portrayal of Indians, the trappers and hunters, the pioneers, the early settlers, and then the Rapites and the Owenites. According to the synopsis of the event, I've been looking, the actual pageant itself seems to be missing. So we have the synopsis, we don't have the full pageant. One of the original features was found in the development of the use of the fire. So light starts dark and then progressively gets lighter as civilization is brought. It's symbolic to the progress of civilization. Starting as a fire, it became the settlers' campfire, then the Civil War campfire, and then the forge fire of modern industry. So again, it's at Boise Fields. Its first scene begins with this poem written by Albius Fellow Bacon. It is a chant of the spirit of nature to the tune of Grieg's Dawn. You all know Grieg's Dawn. It is the morning song that it was used to be played in Warner Brothers Looney Tunes cartoons to symbolize morning. It's very, very familiar. But they would utilize it to tune the audience to imagine the time when these fields and forests that we now know as Indiana had never known the foot of man. When its mineral treasures were locked, useless in the earth, when its fruits were ungathered, wasted, except as good for bird and beast, when year followed year as a twilight dream. The spirit of nature first appears and chants an appeal to the powers of the earth and the sky to send man and the master from whom earth was created and to send him light. So in response to this appeal come the mound builders with dim, glimmering lights, veiled and cloaked in mystery. The dim light is to show, according to Bacon, that civilization is not yet dawned. And in this dim light come the Indians with firebrands. It is only with the arrival of William Henry Harrison that the light starts to really fill the stage. In the Grand Army Parade, which was one feature of the celebration, there are floats depicting historical scenes. A parade was held for the pageant, and the Indian float was manned by Clint Rose, A. Eller Bush, Dr. E.P. Buss, with an escort of the Red Men tribes of Waukee, Reed, and Pocahontas. So this over here is the Fraternal Order of the Red Men. The Improved Order of the Red Men is a fraternal organization that has absolutely no connection to Indigenous peoples whatsoever, but they are inspired and pattern their often erroneous understandings of Indigenous beliefs and ceremonies that craft narratives of that justify settler conquest. They are very popular throughout the late 19th century. In 1885, they also create the Ladies' Auxiliary of the Improved Order of the Red Man, which is the degree of Pocahontas that is organized throughout the country. And this is a fantastic example of settlers playing Indian. And so I actually have an entire collection from my Florida research of these individuals, of little 12-year-old girls dressing up as Pocahontas as part of their degree of ordering into the red men. So additionally though, the city of Evansville sent 500 or 600 children to Corydon for their centennial celebration as well. So Evansville is very proud of their involvement. They really set the stage for the centennial pageants. For Posey, the entire cast of the Posey County pageant were members of the Redmen's Lodge of Griffin. County chairs and chairman was the businessman, Honorable L.T. Osborne, oversaw the pageant, with one publication noting it was very fitting that the county, which had really seen the birth of pageantry in Indiana, should present its contribution to centennial pageantry. And I'm looking forward to learning more about that. 2 years before, wide attention had been attracted by the New Harmony pageant, which was written by Miss Charity Dye of the Historical Commission and directed by Mrs. Mary H. Flanner, Indianapolis. Mrs. Flanner also worked on the Posey County pageant for the centennial, as well as Mrs. Norati, I'm going to mess up her name, Bertochinut, of New Harmony. The Posey County celebration was held on September 12th and 13th at Mount Vernon. On the evening of the 13th, the pageant was presented on the bank of the Ohio River, the historic water highway of the Old Northwest. As the recorded summary states, the pageant was more than a faithful portrayal of the history it dramatized. It was compellingly beautiful in its symbolism. It was introduced by a beautiful dance of the water nymphs, typifying the Ohio. So Vanderburgh had the spirit of nature, but Posey gets water nymphs, followed by the representation of the forest primeval and the dance of the dryads and the fireflies, which must have been quite an amazing scene. The first episode, entitled 100 Years Ago, included the typical life of the Indians, the appearance of the fur traders, missionaries, and the coming of Tom Jones, the first white settler in the county, and the pioneers. The second episode, called Civilization, had to do primarily with the Rappites and the New Harmony experiment, which attracted to the new country the famous boatload of knowledge. That part of the episode portrayed the life and culture of this new Athens of the West, but again, like most other pageants, Indigenous peoples were not present anywhere to be found. The thrilling presentation was viewed by about 15,000 people from Illinois, Kentucky, and Indiana. Alongside the pageant, they also had a historical and industrial parade and a series of addresses. Turning our attention to the text of the pageant, as Posey's pageant does exist in its entirety, first look upon the Indian in this primal scene. Canoes are their favorite watercraft. Their wandering lives teach the use of temporary abodes. They build their teepee and their campfire. These are all examples of common settler myths, tropes about Indigenous peoples. Teepees are not to be found in the Ohio Valley, nor are Indigenous peoples of the Eastern Woodlands nomadic by any stretch of the imagination. These are ideas that have begun ingrained into the national mythology. The scene ends with Indians passing out of the region, passing out of the history of the area, despite the fact that, again, I'm laboring a point, but Indigenous people are still here in Indiana and in the Ohio and Wabash Valley. Many families have never left. Last County, Warwick, held its celebrations the latest at Boonville on September 28th and 29th. Had 1,300 participants, so not as many as Evansville, not 4,000. It was prepared by Mrs. Ada Hopkins, Mrs. Nell Fulling, Miss Gladys Goat, Mrs. Natalie Wilson, and William L. Barker. The director of the pageant was T. Tillman. As in all the pageants, episode 1 was about the Indians of the region and graphically depicts the savage, semi-civilized habits and customs of the Native American race. Of interest, this episode begins with a, quote, beautiful fantasy in which Pan rules supreme in the presence of wood nymphs, fireflies, butterflies, and their magical blossoms, fairies, moonbeams, and starlights who, quote, dance about in abandon of joy and freedom, suddenly to be dispersed by the intrusion of the red man. Warwick also held a choral concert assembled by Mrs. Mina Thornburg and directed by Miss Marion Graham and addressed by Judge Roscoe Kuiper, with agricultural products and industrial lectures. It was effective, Warwick sponsor said, in bringing together town and country together in a united effort. Now naturally, I love Imagine the Pageantry, and it's very interesting to see how different counties are bringing these first scenes together to imagine a chanting of this poem. But why also should we revisit these pageants? And Eliot's history. Words and stories are important. Instead of simply dismissing past historical narratives or pageants as quaint yarns of yesteryear, as Bus puts it, these examples showcase how they operated as symbolic moments that still inform our understanding of the region's history. This dispossession, acted out in the Pageant of Indiana and in the paraprofessional histories of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, have informed the histories of the 20th century and the ways in which the regular population view Indiana history. It reveals the underlying problem with the ways Americans have told and retold stories about the end of the moving frontier. In short, they have historicized the region's indigenous peoples and have exiled them to the past. This, in effect, leaves no room for the complicated realities of life in the region, where whites and Indians shared a physical space and often relied on one another for their livelihoods. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions?
I mean, when did the redneck start being shoved out of the memory of the horrible things that we did to them? I mean, how did, was the journeys out of Indiana, is that when it started, that we turned to complete, white supremacy?
Oh, when we started telling these stories? Well, a lot of this has to do with the narrative that starts to emerge right after the 7 Years' War. So at the horrors of the 7 Years' War, how violent it had been, both for indigenous groups that were allied with the French and indigenous groups that had been allied with the settlers and with the British, there comes about in the western territories of Pennsylvania and Ohio a shift from working alongside indigenous groups, a shift towards, in many ways, a genocidal hatred. And a lot of that is in response to the violence that takes place. Fort William Henry, for example, in the New York frontier. And then as we move into the violence of the American Revolution, the stories that start to emerge, often erroneously on both sides, starts to create this idea of a desire for separateness. And so you start to see this in Knox, in particular, Washington's general, and then Washington himself throughout the early Republic. But what I'm interested in and what I look at when I look at these stories is I'm not looking necessarily at the bigger national trends and a lot of the work that I do. I'm more interested in the individual stories. You know, that we are talking about, when we're talking about the settlement of Indiana and Ohio, we're talking about groups that have had contact with settlers and with traders for hundreds of years at this point, and there has been a great deal of accommodation. And so when we get into the story where it's just about removal, and it's just about violence, and it's just about labeling indigenous peoples as being problematic, I like to take a look down. Let's take a look at the individual families and these groups in the region.
Thank you.
So what tribe or tribes did it go to?
Right here, So this is land that is claimed by a number of groups. So it's claimed by the Kickapoo, the Pinchot, the Shawnee, the Miami, the Delaware, the Cherokee, the Iroquois lay claim. The Iroquois lay claim to the entire eastern woodlands, so keep that in mind. They have everything up to basically the Gulf of Mexico in the Iroquois mind. But so groups that would have actually been living here, Shawnee and Miami.
I've read that Plains Indians often took escaped slaves as prisoners, servitude, that kind of thing. Did the woodlands do the same kind of thing?
Absolutely. So one of the areas that I have done extensive research on is indigenous activity in taking the other natives and selling them into slavery throughout the colonial Southeast. So you see groups that are going to be armed by English traders in particular, who are then selling other indigenous groups, often their enemies, into slavery. Those groups are then sent off to the Sugar Islands in the Caribbean, and the funds taken from that enslavement is used to import African slaves into the Southeast. So as you can see, as you can tell, the story is much more complicated. There's a lot of layers, a lot of different levels to think about here. In a Hollywood movie, it's easy to assign good guy, bad guy, white hat, black hat, but the reality is that we have to, I like to take a look at individual groups. Did you have something, Walker? Forgot it. Oh, I answered.
Well, this is just a small gift from us. Thank you so much. I think I speak for everybody in saying that was extremely, extremely interesting, and I hope you can come back as you learn more and share with us.
I would absolutely love to. This has gotten me so interested in knowing more and taking on another level. Again, I want to know more about that New Harmony pageant and why they get the name for having the history. They're the good ones with the pageant. So I want to know more about that.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.